Okay, so let's go over this renin to angiotensin II to aldosterone pathway. And again, remember the granular cells. We're going to find those in the juxtaglomerular apparatus near the afferent arteriole. And their job is they're going to release renin into the bloodstream so it can convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin I. Angiotensin I will circulate to the lungs where there's an enzyme called ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme. And the angiotensin I will be converted to angiotensin II. Angiotensin I will be converted to angiotensin II in the lungs by the angiotensin converting enzyme. Now maybe you've heard of ACE inhibitors, so that'd be something that would prevent that from happening. Angiotensin II then again, also causes the efferent arteriole to constrict, therefore increasing the glomerular filtration rate. Okay, but what else it does is it goes to the adrenal gland, triggering it to actually release aldosterone. Now, aldosterone is ultimately going to help us conserve the water in our urine. So it's going to concentrate the urine and not going to let us lose too much water in it. It will do that with the help of another hormone called antidiuretic hormone. We'll talk about it. Aldosterone actually does it by triggering cells to build sodium-potassium pumps and sodium channels, and we'll talk about that later. But bottom line is aldosterone helps us conserve water instead of losing water. So aldosterone's helping us conserve water. Angiotensin II has that vasoconstrictor effect, and of course ultimately that also helps increase our blood pressure. The other thing that will cause aldosterone to be released from the adrenal gland is high concentrations of potassium in our blood. So if we have high concentration of potassium in our blood, then it will also, when it circulates to the adrenal gland, also trigger to release aldosterone, which again will help us hold on to more water and not lose as much water in our urine. Now notice I've got a lot of potassium in the blood here, and I've got sodium here in the filtrate, which I'm turning into urine. Okay, but since potassium helps us increase aldosterone, then what aldosterone is going to do is going to go into the cells here in the distal convoluted tubule. It's going to cause those cells to build sodium-potassium pumps. So what it's going to end up doing is pumping the sodium out into the interstitium and the potassium in. So I've got excess potassium. Now I have a way to get rid of it. For example,
ALDOSTERONE exerts its effect by inserting additional channels in the distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct of the kidney. This allows more sodium to move from the filtrate into the plasma and potassium to move from the plasma into the filtrate.
Okay, so again, let's look at what's happening. Aldosterone, we need it to help us conserve water. What it actually does, it actually, again, can be released from the renin-aldosterone pathway we talked about, or from excess potassium being in our blood. So once the aldosterone is released, it's what it's going to actually activate. It's going to act on the cells of the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. What it's going to do is going to trigger those cells to build more sodium-potassium pumps, and what the sodium-potassium pump's going to do is going to pump the sodium that was here into the interstitium, and then it's going to pump the potassium that was out here into the duct. Okay, now you might say, well, how does that help with water? Well, any water that's in here, once we increase the osmolarity of the interstitium, remember water always goes from high water concentration to where there's less water concentration. Well, if I pump a bunch of sodium in here, I make it less water concentration, therefore water will want to leave and follow it. Okay, now in our picture here, I've got sodium over here and sodium over there. And it says drag the sodium in the direction it will move if aldosterone is present. Well, if aldosterone is present, it's going to cause the cells in the distal convoluted tubule, the cells in here, and the cells in the collecting duct to build sodium-potassium pumps. Well, if they build sodium-potassium pumps, they're going to pump sodium into the interstitium. So if they're going to pump sodium into the interstitium, then this wouldn't move from the blood to the interstitium. It would move from here to the interstitium because the aldosterone put those doorways or those pumps in the cells in the tubules. So therefore, sodium here would move into the interstitium initially and then eventually back into the blood. Well, again, the good thing about that is when I make this interstitium here have a higher osmolarity, a higher sodium content, water will definitely want to follow that. So therefore, I'll lose water from the filtrate and it won't continue in the urine, so my urine will be more concentrated. So if I am dehydrated, then I definitely want to pull water out of here, and my antidiuretic hormone and my aldosterone helps me do that. Okay, and again, if I've got potassium here and potassium here, because I filtered this potassium out, but I had excess potassium, in my blood, probably due to my diet or some other potential things, then aldosterone, what does it do again? Well, it helps build sodium-potassium pumps. We're always pumping more sodium out and potassium back in, but there's always more sodium being pumped out than potassium pumped in. But here the question is, which way will potassium move? Well, since the aldosterone is causing these cells in here to build sodium-potassium pumps, pumping potassium inside, therefore the potassium will move from here to here. And I will lose more potassium in my urine. So if I'm dehydrated, I might expect to find a lot of potassium in my urine. And here we can see my potassium move this way. Now, antidiuretic hormone is the other hormone that affects the water, and it can work with or without the aldosterone. But again, what does aldosterone do? It triggers the cells in here to build sodium-potassium pumps. Well, what does antidiuretic hormone do? Well, it's actually made in the hypothalamus, released to the posterior pituitary, then it goes into our bloodstream. It's made in the hypothalamus because the hypothalamus is monitoring our brain for different things, and one of the things it's monitoring is how hydrated are we. Does our fluid have a high osmolarity, meaning we are, more diluted water, so we don't have as much water, or are we a little bit more hydrated and have lower osmolarity? So anyway, if we have a high osmolarity, meaning we're dehydrated, the hypothalamus detects that, starts producing antidiuretic hormone, actually deposits and releases it from the posterior pituitary. Now, what does antidiuretic hormone do? Well, it also comes to the cells here, but it doesn't regulate or have anything to do with the salt or the sodium. What it does, it actually builds more water channels. So if I have more doorways for water to go through, it will, especially if I increase the osmolarity of the interstitium, then the water will definitely want to follow, because we know in our tonicity descriptions that hypertonic solutions draw more water towards them. Now what I have here are the cells in the late distal convoluted tubule and the cortical collecting duct. Okay, so that means that here are my two hormones we were just talking about: antidiuretic hormone, which has to do with water channels, and aldosterone, that has to do with our sodium-potassium pumps. Again, the aldosterone is actually going to come from the adrenal gland, and the antidiuretic hormone is going to come from the posterior pituitary, but it was actually made in the hypothalamus. Now, in this normal luminal cell, of course, we've got a sodium channel, potassium channel. We got a sodium-potassium pump. Aldosterone, however, is going to increase the number of pumps there. Now notice how we have more sodium-potassium pumps, and we even have more doorways for sodium. So what we're going to do is we're going to pump all the sodium out of this cell into the interstitium. Notice how it's darker, meaning there's more sodium, meaning it has a higher osmolarity. Okay, now if my hormone tells the cell to build these proteins, you guys do remember transcription and translation and cell signalers that, go to the gene that tells me how to build these, and goes through transcription, and then we go through translation and actually build it and insert it into the cell membrane. Well, now if I'm pumping more sodium out of here, then more sodium is going to want to run from the higher concentration through the cell where I pumped it out and eventually be pumped out itself. Notice that I also have potassium. Well, I have my potassium, but in this case, I'm pumping potassium into the cell. So now my potassium is going to go from a high concentration where I pumped it in through the potassium channels into my urine. Okay. Now, water at this point, if I don't have my antidiuretic hormone, water can seep between the cells, because again, water wants to go from the high concentration of water to this lower concentration of water, and it's a lower concentration of water because I've made it a higher concentration of other things. In other words, I've made it a higher concentration of sodium. I've increased its osmolarity. Now notice, antidiuretic hormone triggers the cell to build extra water channels. So if I increase the osmolarity here, and I'm pumping potassium this way, sodium this way, but always more sodium than potassium, I'm increasing the osmolarity. And now I put more water channels in here. Now more water is going to be able to come through this cell and try to equalize this. Remember, it's always trying to reach equilibrium, and this whole osmotic gradient of going from high water concentration to where water is less concentrated until we reach equilibrium is going to pull water out of the filtrate back into the interstitium, that fluid that's between the cells of my tubules and the cells of my capillaries. So this is called the luminal side because it's next to the filtrate where the lumen is. This is called the basolateral side because it's next to the interstitium. Notice again how the antidiuretic hormone has not only caused me to build water channels in the basolateral side, but also put them in the luminal side, so water easily will come through into the cell and back out of the cell. And of course, water is running from the high concentration to the lower concentration. Notice how this is lighter now because the water being removed is diluting it, trying to reach equilibrium with it. But ultimately what we're doing is we're pulling water out of the urine so we don't lose too much of it, because we shouldn't be releasing these two hormones unless we are dehydrated. If we're well hydrated, we can afford to lose the water. Matter of fact, we would want to lose the water. Okay, another important function of these cells, these especially cells called intercalated cells, is they actually release protons or hydrogen ions into the filtrate, because this is another way besides the lung. This is the metabolic way that we control our pH. So if I'm getting rid of, remember, by definition, bases receive protons and acids give up protons. So if I am balancing that pH level, here is where I'm going to give up those protons and not hold on to them, but get rid of protons and put it into my urine. So I'm kind of acidifying, in a sense, my urine. So our kidneys are actually getting rid of the waste products from our cells, the nitrogenous wastes that we talked about, but they're also balancing my water and ion balance as well as balancing my pH. So they do several things, along with secrete the hormone erythropoietin, which of course is helping me make my red blood cells. So kidneys do several extremely important life giving or life altering processes that we cannot live without.